My God, this harkens back to the attitudes around slavery and so on, the international division of humanity. One hopes that they don't decide to go to war against China merely because they can't produce high speed rail. Instead of going to war, yeah, it's like a
That's so
playground
crazy.
thing. Yeah, if you have the best toys, I'm going to smack you and steal them rather than try to get your own. There is mass support for the Palestinians in the Arab world, mass support. These temporary victories are not going to go forever. The Zionists will eat each other up. They are already doing that. Nothing is permanent. United States as well. The only hope in human history is the hope we have that we are able to move the contradictions to the good side of history. That's the only hope.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Since the Al Aqsa flood on October 7th, the US and Europe have supported Israel in orchestrating a live streamed Holocaust in Gaza that has shocked the world. This came at a time when US empire appeared to be in decline, challenged by the emergence of other major powers like Russia, China, and Iran. Conversations about a multipolar world seem to signal the possibility of greater autonomy for nations in the global south. Yet, in the aftermath of October 7th and the fragmentation of the so called resistance axis, Israel and the US seem emboldened, asserting their dominance with unprecedented ferocity. Fueled by what they perceive as victory, their actions reflect a growing intolerance for any defiance of US imperialism across the globe. Their international division of humanity has never been more apparent. But their escalation of brutality shouldn't be mistaken for a sign of strength. Instead, the increasing reliance of the US and its allies on medieval tactics of repression and punishment to subdue populations in the global south could be viewed as evidence of a declining empire rather than an ascendant one. From the daily mass killings in Gaza and the economic strangulation of Cuba to the provocations against Russia and China, these actions bear the hallmarks of a desperate, decaying, hyper-imperial hegemon, too arrogant to acknowledge its overreach and internal decay. To unpack these developments and more, I'm joined by author, historian, and journalist Vijay Prashad, executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, chief correspondent for Globetrotter, and chief editor of Leftward Books. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Thank you so much for coming back to Dispatches. This is one of our first episodes of 2025, so I feel very privileged to have you on to discuss many various topics related to the issue of imperialism, or as we should be calling it these days, hyper-imperialism. And, I've been watching a lot of I've been reading your recent articles and watching some of your recent interviews. And there was a term I wanted to kind of open with here to start on, because and I've heard you say it before, but I want to sort of focus in on it. And that is the phrase international division of humanity. And I think this is a really good way to kind of contextualize where we're at in 2025. And I mean, imperialism has always had this international division of humanity. But I think given the last 15 months of genocide in Gaza, where we've seen that depravity just kind of reach new heights, sort of taking all of the horrific criminal atrocities over the last several decades and like kind of combining them together and then multiplying them by 10 or 100 is what we're witnessing in Gaza. So I'm curious if you could open on that as we enter a new year, 2025. Where are we on this international division of humanity? And also, what do you mean when you say that? And please feel free to put that in the context of imperialism and Gaza.
You go back to the 1990s, it was a really triumphant moment for the West in particular, because people were at the time led by, Bill Clinton, by Tony Blair. They were making an argument about shaping the world around human rights, around world trade. The World Trade Organization was established in 1994. Soviet Union had collapsed. These were the two key phrases: human rights, world trade, and the world was going to be a different place. In the middle of this, Lawrence Summers, famous economist from Harvard University, working then at the World Bank, wrote a memorandum. Which, when I read the memo, I seriously thought this was a joke, that he was doing a kind of, send up in the manner of Jonathan Swift, because Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels, wrote this text during the famine called A Modest Proposal, which was, again, a very critical, difficult to read text, because Swift was basically saying you're letting the Irish starve. So he said, well, we have an excess of children and we have limited food, so maybe we should just eat the children. Very difficult to read text by Swift. So when I read Larry Summers' text in the 90s, I thought, well, it's the same kind of joke. In fact, I don't think it was a joke. I mean, I know it was not a joke. What Summers wrote in the 1990s, at a time of human rights, world trade, and so on, is that the United States has an excess of garbage, has an excess of trash, all kinds of trash, plastics, all kinds of garbage, and has a lot of money. The African continent has too little trash, doesn't produce enough trash, and has very little money. So, why doesn't the United States export its trash to Africa? I mean, I read this and I thought, well, that's a silly kind of economist joke. In fact, he was being serious. In the name of world trade, let's balance things out by exporting garbage to Africa. By the way, you didn't need Lawrence Summers to write this, because this has been the situation for decades prior to Summers' memorandum, is that trash from the West has been mailed to the third world. This is the attitude of the international division of humanity. This is the attitude in the era, perfectly happy talking about human rights and equality and all that. And of course, world trade as the great balancer. And then saying, let's just go and dump our trash there. Or let's treat these people like trash. We have a problem with them. Let's go to war against them. We don't like Manuel Noriega anymore in Panama, 1989. Let's just go and violate the sovereignty of Panama, grab him, bomb the country, bring him to a prison in Florida. We don't like Saddam Hussein anymore, who we used to fund. Let's just go and bomb Iraq in 1991, crater the capital city. And well, they had an idea that they were going to go and grab him. They didn't. They grabbed him later in 2003. But that was the idea. Let's just treat these people like lesser forms of humanity. You'll still have the orchestra playing human rights. You'll still have the orchestra playing world trade, but we'll behave as if they are savages and barbarians. And I've been so for a very long time. So this international division of humanity, it continues. I mean, the way that the West is treating the Palestinians of Gaza in particular, I mean, obviously all the Palestinians, but the Palestinians of Gaza in particular, treating them like garbage, treating them like they are on the other side of the international division of humanity. This is the same behavior as the West shows towards much of African countries, Asia, Latin America, garbage. The attitude to China: China cannot develop, China cannot have advanced technology, it must pause its development. This is the same attitude. They are on the other side of the international division of humanity. They cannot be allowed to challenge the West economically. This goes against the rules of hyperimperialism. But you don't even need a concept like imperialism or hyperimperialism. It goes against the rules of the international division of humanity. How dare the Chinese play in the same league as the West? The West plays in League One, and the Chinese are supposed to be in League Three. That they are contesting the West when it comes to manufacturing, cell phones and so on, high speed rail. This is an outrage. They have to go back to their place. They have to know their place. My God, this harkens back to the attitudes around slavery and so on, the international division of humanity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, that it harkens back to the times of slavery in terms of the attitude towards people. And you've also spoken a lot recently about this kind of intolerance to defiance by the Israelis and their backers, the Europeans, the Americans, the people who you place in the lead of this hyper imperialist order that we're living in today. And you talk a lot about words that I want to just say because I think they're important. You describe this hyper imperialism and the rulers of it as being decadent, mediocre, and dangerous. And I want to go back to that as I just say this other thing, which is, I think I started to feel a little bit naive because I think before not just the genocide in Gaza, but before the kind of fragmentation and really destruction of the so-called axis of resistance, I was of the view that we have this increasingly multipolar world where, the rise of Russia and China and Iran and just these other poles of power that would give breathing space to the global South after this unipolar order with the US hegemon in the lead and just controlling everyone. I thought that would be a good thing. Um, and what I've seen instead is that it seems like the US is more dangerous than it's ever been, even if it's in a kind of decline, which we can also talk about. But before we get to that, I guess I'm curious if you can just explain what you mean when you're talking about this hyper imperialist order that's decadent, mediocre, which I love that part, but also dangerous. Because I think going into 2025, like we've seen a kind of lens into that danger in Gaza, and I think it speaks to kind of, not saying that we're going to see the US act like Gaza in the US necessarily, but it seems to have set a precedent for what's to come.
Well, let's start with the word dangerous because I think this is the key word. And I've never been keen on the idea of multipolarity as a institutional shape now. I think it's perhaps something of the future, but we are nowhere near anything like that now. Let's stay with the word dangerous. In our institute, when we published the text Hyperimperialism, people were pretty surprised to look at the section on military spending, because one of the things that our researchers found is that the military spending, as defined by the Stockholm Institute, which is one of the most important places that keeps the numbers, as it were, is a little deflated. They deflate U.S. and much of European military spending. Is don't really add in lots of parts of the military spending, like the nuclear spend and so on. Anyway, we looked at the military spending. Our researchers really dug deep into the US budget. What we found was in 2022, and I think this is even worse subsequent to that, 74.3% of the total of global military spending is spent by the United States and the NATO powers. The US is by far the largest part of that. China spends 10% of world military spending, and the Russians spent 3%. You add Russia and China together, which you shouldn't do because it's not a military alliance, whereas the NATO powers are a military alliance. But if you do add them together, that's 13% standing against 74.3%. Now, it's not true that all of that 74.3% is wasted. That's what Elon Musk and company are saying about the US military budget. It's not wasted. A lot of it is spent on very dangerous machinery that can destroy people, 2,000-pound bombs and so on. Nobody can conduct the kind of ceaseless genocide that Israel has been conducting without being attached to the US military machine. It's the United States that provides the bombs and so on that Israel has been dropping, those 2,000-pound bombs. Nobody else has that capacity to sustain so much destruction. And we're not even talking about nuclear, we're talking about non nuclear material. That makes the United States and its allies extremely dangerous. They can destroy anything, which is why, for instance, and I hope we will talk about Iran, which is why Iran fears annihilation, because the United States can just come in and aerial bombard parts of Iran, or provide the Israelis with the material to do so, and it could have a detrimental effect on Iranian civilization. This is a worry, and I would stand on the idea that Iran could be destroyed by this dangerous power. That's the dangerous part of it. Then let's come to the decadent part of it. You see, when you have advantages, when you have wealth of a great magnitude, the question that could be asked is, well, you have a lot of wealth, Rania. What are you doing with it? Are you doing anything interesting with it? Well, I'm going to do what people do. I'm going to buy a big yacht, a big palace. I'm just going to spend it on junk. I'm going to buy a lot of jewelry. Oh, I'm going to build a swimming pool, fill it with the most expensive champagne or whatever. That's decadent. That's a decadent use of your resources. On the other hand, I say to you, what are you going to do? Well, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out how to restart Lebanon's old great silk manufacturing and soap manufacturing. There's a huge market opportunity to go back and reproduce some of the really great historical silks of Lebanon. I'm going to build a factory. I'm going to build silkworm processing, yards and so on. I'm going to employ lots of people. I'm going to create productive activity. Well, that's not decadent. That's productive. You're producing something interesting. People are getting employed. Maybe you build cooperatives of silk producers and so on. If you take this example and ask, well, what's the West doing with its money? Well, it's not being productive. Why in the United States has a city like Los Angeles cut the fire department's budget, knowing full well that Los Angeles is a bowl of fire, potential fire, and not just in the summer. The Pacific Palisades fire took place in the winter, when it's supposed to not be so dry. It's in the summer that you see catastrophic fires like this. This is the winter. Why did they cut the fire department budget? These are crucial public utilities. I would never cut a fire department. Why is it that the water sources to the cities of Los Angeles and other Californian cities are so deeply controlled by by the nut manufacturers and so on, who own vast acreages of land in the hinterlands of these cities, and grow pistachios, grow walnuts, and so on. It's incredibly productive nut manufacturing, but they have the lock on the water supply. Why are these cities so dry? Where is the fire department? Instead of spending money on that, you're spending money on the latest systems of destruction. How to go in and destroy the Palestinians of Gaza. So much money spent on dropping 2,000-pound bombs on Gaza. Where was the money for the fire department of California, Pacific Palisades, and so on? That's decadent leadership. And then the third term, mediocre. You have mediocrity because if you don't have a broad understanding of history, a broad understanding of the nature of the world, the dynamic of the world, you end up with a mediocre understanding of the world. So, for instance, I don't think people in the United States, even in Europe, which is closer to Iran, I don't think these countries understand Iranian civilization. I don't think they understand the role of Iran in the region. Iran plays a role that goes back long before Ayatollah Khomeini, before even the Shahs, before Cyrus, the Emperor Darius, and so on. Iran has a vastly important role in the entire region, just as Turkey does, just as the Arabs do. I mean, these are old, competing sometimes, but also interlocking civilizations. They have very complicated relationships. The Turks have a very complicated relationship with the Arabs and the Iranians. I mean, Turkey is not just Turkey; it goes all the way as a civilization into Central Asia. It's very, very old, units of civilization. Iran, the same. One of the largest cities with an enormous cultural impact of Iran is the city of Lucknow in northern India. You go through the city of Lucknow, the impact of Iranian civilization is all over the place. So but my point is that if you don't understand this, you have a mediocre assessment of the world. You see the world extremely narrowly. Let's overthrow the government in Iran. Let's overthrow the Cuban Revolution. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's reshape the world. You see, this mediocrity was apparent when George W. Bush and his cronies thought, well, we'll just overthrow Saddam Hussein and we'll be greeted with sweets and flowers. Wait a minute. You don't understand the civilization of the Iraqi people, in fact, of the Arabs. You don't understand the interlocking nature with the Iranians and so on. When they overthrew Saddam, they were surprised to find a government emerge that was greatly antithetical to the United States and close to Tehran. They were surprised because they had a mediocre understanding of the world. They are dangerous people, they
Yeah.
are decadent people, and they are mediocre people. That is really how I would sum up the leadership right now of the West.
And you take those, that's like a recipe for even more danger to come. And I want to bring that to the issue of the global south. And well, let's start with Gaza. Because I think, again, I want to go back to, I don't think that like everywhere is going to look like or be Gaza. I think, but Gaza definitely has had a new president. But a lot of people see Gaza and they think, oh, that's Israel that's done that. And it is Israel that has carried out a genocide at Gaza. But as you mentioned, this could not have been possible without the support, first and foremost, the military weapons that the US has given Israel to carry out not just its genocide in Gaza, but its destruction in Lebanon and other surrounding countries, but also support from the Europeans. Why? I guess is my question. Like, what do they get out of it? I know you said that you don't think this is a debate worth having of who controls who, Israel, the U.S. But I believe the U.S. is controlling Israel. Israel's like an aircraft carrier for the U.S., right? But then it is fair to ask, what do the U.S. and Europe and the Five Eyes countries, what do they gain from genocide in Gaza? Why invest so much in the destruction of the Palestinian people?
Well, when this conflict began, or when the genocidal bombardment began in Gaza, it was not exactly clear to me what was going on. Why this ferocity? Why were the European and the United States, why were they rallying behind Israel so firmly? It was not clear to me. I very much admit it. But it began to become clearer and clearer what Mr. Netanyahu was seeking when he entered. He sent his troops into Lebanon, and they went viciously against Hezbollah positions, including, of course, the assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah, with a massive bomb blast, which destroyed 8-story buildings and so on. I mean, it became clearer and clearer what was happening. Then, when I listened to Mr. Netanyahu give his speech, where he said earlier in December of last year, December 2024, Mr. Netanyahu said that, look, I had said, he said a year ago, in other words, in December of 2023, he had said that at the end of this, the Palestinians are not going to be the same as they were before. The Lebanese are not going to be the same. Syria was not going to be the same, etc., etc. That speech really made me think about the war aims that Israel has put forward. And perhaps this is what was discussed early on with the United States. You see, they have been keen, including the Europeans, of settling what they considered to be the dispute with Iran. They want to settle this dispute against the interests of Iran. And I feel like they have been put on the back foot when the Chinese brought the Iranians and the Saudis to Beijing, where they did a handshake and Saudi Iranian relations began to come together. At the time, the United States tried to intervene during a G20 meeting in Delhi by saying, look, we're going to create this Saudi, Middle East, India corridor, where from Gujarat in India, they will open a kind of free trade corridor that was going to go through Dubai, up Saudi Arabia, to the port of Haifa in Israel, and then to Greece. This would have effectively normalized relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel if this trade route was going to be allowed, because it would mean a Saudi trade route that would go through Israel and use the port of Haifa. Um, so, this was what the US was putting on the table and would certainly have created problems between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Well, this began to go ahead, and then about a month later, the events of October 7th, 2023 took place when Hamas and others broke the boundaries of the perimeter fence, and this entire onslaught began. Um, in a way, when the genocide began, one forgot about all these prior developments, which were very important. In other words, on the one side, the Chinese trying to bring the Iranians and Saudis together. This is a huge benefit for the Chinese because their Belt and Road initiative kind of relies on using the territory of Iran to get to Saudi Arabia. I mean, they also have a corridor, a trade corridor, which they're interested in. And the United States came in a sort of trivial childhood game and said, no, you can't build your corridor. We're going to build our corridor, which is going to include Israel. And therefore, we'll create animosity, further animosity between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Well, this genocide screwed everything up in a way for everybody. Yeah. It sort of upturned the apple cart, but not really, because what the Israelis have put on the table is something interesting. What the Israelis have been able to do, I think, without people taking the big picture, we haven't seen what they're doing. What they've been able to do is through this immense bombardment, they have weakened Hamas. There is no doubt about it. Hamas inside Gaza is not able to be the Hamas of a previous period. They have killed, leader upon leader of Hamas, and they have weakened Hamas's command and control structure and its resources. I mean, the entire north of Gaza is a ruin. They've done it viciously. They've broken everything in order to weaken Hamas, but they did it. Then, secondly, they weakened Hezbollah. I mean, whatever people may say, the assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah is an enormous blow to Hezbollah. He was a key figure who brought together the military and the political aspects together. He was himself a really, really important leader and an important theoretician for Hezbollah. I mean, this is like when Hugo Chavez died. It has the similar kind of impact, and it has weakened Hezbollah because it's not just one leader. They have killed off a large swath of the leadership, also the mid-level leadership in southern Lebanon, and they continue to pummel southern Lebanon. They continue to hit Hezbollah's little logistical supply areas and so on. So they weakened Hezbollah. That means, yes, Hamas is not what it was. The Palestinian resistance is not what it was. Hezbollah is not what it was for now. Maybe it'll reconstruct, but it's not what it was now. And then, crucially, the Israelis provided absolutely vital air support to Mr. Jolani and the Hayat Tahrir al-Shams to ride down, the highway from Idlib to seize that corridor, which remained basically under the control of the Syrian government. I mean, they smashed the Syrian military positions. They hit Iranian posts hard in the lead up to Jolani's advance. Crucially, this was not paid attention to much, but the Israelis were bombing inside Damascus. They hit the intelligence ministry. They hit small ministries of the military. They demoralized the military. They bombed everybody. And they basically helped overthrow the Assad government and then went in and seized a large part of the demilitarized zone that the UN had set up in 1974. What they have done, and this is what I think people need to pay attention to, is that, you see, previously what Qasem Soleimani had been able to organize through the Al-Quds brigade of the Iranian military force was this buffer for Iran, that if anybody tried to attack Iran, this buffer, Hezbollah, sections of the Palestinian resistance, certainly sections of the Iraqi and Syrian resistance that were in Syria, would fire rockets at Israel. They would attack Israel, in other words, from proximity. So any attack on Iran would be met by this proximitous attack on Israel. What the Israelis have done in this 1 year period, maybe a little more than a year, is they've destroyed everything that Qasem Soleimani had built up. Not only was Mr. Soleimani assassinated by the Americans in Baghdad, but then subsequent to that, they've destroyed large parts of the Palestinian resistance. They've destroyed a large part of the strength of Hezbollah, and they've removed Syria because Mr. Jolani, who's now, of course, changed his name, but let's call him Mr. Jolani for the heck of it. Mr. Jolani and the government in Syria has said that they will not allow attacks on Iran. That means the only force
On
which is
Israel.
continuing on Israel, the only force that is continuing to attack Israel and has the capacity is the Ansar Allah group in Yemen, which is also taking a pummeling recently. They are preparing the ground for a possible attack on Iran. And I think this is what's quite terrifying, that, if you're in Iran, and that's why Iran conducted a massive military exercise, the 19th sequential military exercise, but this one was bigger than any others, and it concentrated in Western Iran. A massive military exercise in early January of this year, as a way to strengthen the military and say, get ready, because they are coming for us. In fact, very poorly reported in the media, two other points to put on the table is during all of this, in October of last year, the Israelis bombed several military and academic sites in Iran, very poorly reported in the West, claiming that these were nuclear weapons producing sites. Many of them are places where Iran produces ballistic missiles, which they had been transporting by land to their allies in the Middle East. They've attacked those ballistic missile producing sites. And then, again, almost not reported, the Iranian foreign ministry publicly said, we are open to talks. But the West doesn't want talks with Iran. They are preparing, lining things up for an
Yeah.
assault on Iran. And I want to say this without being alarmist, but I want to say this. But I think that part of the nature of the virulence against not only the Palestinians in Gaza, but the Lebanese in the south of Lebanon and Beirut, the virulent attack by Israel is not just a virulent attack on these countries or these movements, but it also seems to me a lead up, or at least a message to Iran to stop being defiant.
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us. Yeah, and it's in terms of defiance, I mean, there's just zero tolerance for it now. But I think it's also happening, this 2025 version of imperialism, the depravity, the willingness to just like literally destroy the entire so-called rules-based order that the US created. Or maybe this is the rules-based order the US created, just with mask off, right? But all that's to say, it's happening or has happened in conjunction with this kind of economic decline that is obviously not just in the global north. I mean, whatever happens in the global north, sadly, if it's negative, trickles down to the global south. That's the real trickle down economics. But there has been a kind of economic decline you've talked about when it comes to the US and Europe and others. And I'm just curious if you could speak to that a little bit, and maybe put that in the context of this um, growing appetite to just kind of bulldoze the world.
Yeah, I mean, we don't even need to analyze this. This has been directly said by the people in charge in the West. What have they said? They basically said that, look, they recognize that the rise of the Asian economies ever since the world financial crisis took place in 2007. In our institute, we say that from 2007, the countries led by the West have been in a third great depression. Um, you know, Places like the United States just barely a growth rate that is identifiable. And if you take out financial services, there's a negative growth rate in most of these countries. They are not building infrastructure, they are not building manufacturing and so on. It's effectively financial services and so on. This is a negative growth rate for most of these countries. Germany and so on, puttering along at almost zero growth rate. That's a long-term depression. Yeah. And at the same time, they see the center of gravity of the world economy moving to Asia. They say it openly. Again, we don't need to analyze this. In report after report, they say openly that, within 2 years, within 5 years, within 10 years, this situation is going to be irreversible. In other words, the decline of Western manufacturing and the rise of particularly Asian manufacturing is going to be completely irreversible. Already in many fields, places like China, Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, even Vietnam, and so on, are growing rapidly. And in some sectors, they have surpassed the West. The most obvious sector is high speed rail. The Chinese and the Japanese have innovated high speed rail beyond anything that's happened in Europe. In Europe is miles away from the United States, miles away. I mean, when I was in Beirut, living in Beirut, I used to play a game. I started a kind of fun project of the Beirut to Beijing train. So what I did was I started building a little book, which was going to be the book you get when you board the train at Beirut. You get on the train at Beirut Central Station. Yeah, it's a high speed train. It's in the late afternoon. And what the book I was trying to make as for fun then, but I think it's a real thing for our future, is that as you board, you're given this book and you open it and you start looking at all the meals you're going to get to Beijing. And so as the train leaves Beijing Central Station, you go towards Damascus. Damascus was the first stop. In Damascus, you are given a sort of late tea, and it's going to be Damascene pastries, and you get it with a nice sweet Damascus tea. And then, the train goes into the great Syrian desert towards Iraq, and you get the great dinner, which is you don't go up to Aleppo, but you get the Halab dinner, the great Aleppan dinner, the amazing little Armenian meatballs and so on. And then it's morning in as you get to Baghdad, early morning. You get a little Baghdad snack, and then the train goes to Tehran, and so on. It was my fantasy, a high speed rail, but at each meal you get the meal of the place you're in. I thought, what a lovely little book with a political message about the integration of Asia. People forget Beirut is part of Asia, for God's sake. It's a great Asian train from Beirut to Beijing. The West is concerned, and again I say rightly concerned, because they have identified the fact that that the Western countries are not going to be able to either contest this, let's call it, manufacturing happening in Asia, because that's the epicenter of it now. But it's not really an Asian manufacturing. It's not to do with Asian culture. We shouldn't misunderstand that. It just happens to be happening in Asia. But this is the center of gravity, and things are shifting, and they want to reverse it. And so we have Western documents, US documents, where they directly say, by hook or by crook, we are going to reverse the Chinese advances that they have made in manufacturing. Got to force them. But how do you force them? In a decadent, dangerous world, you use threats, sanctions, tariff policy, and in fact, the threat of threats, which is war. You threaten to attack them. You threaten to bring Taiwan into the US thing. Why not? If the United States can say, let's bring Canada into the US, Greenland into the US, just make Taiwan a state of the US, direct military confrontation with China. They are willing to do all those things. That's the danger and decadence. Why? Because they are right. They are not going to be able to triumph, maintain the dominance of European and US economic hegemony over what's happening in parts of these parts of the world. They just are going to be able to do it. It's real.
So that's how you have The threats to bomb Mexico, to take back the Panama Canal, to take Canada and Greenland, to go after China, to go after Russia. I mean, it's endless. And it's getting just more and more clownish and ridiculous, but in a very, like you said, dangerous way, because these threats are actually real. It's not just pretend. But I think it's interesting with the issue of sanctions and the over reliance on them, with given everything you said, because I saw this statistic was being said by the academic Jason Hickel, had said that more than 60% of all developing countries are now under some form of U.S. sanction, which is just a wild number. And I know, take the world, taking all of it, it's 33% of the world is under U.S. sanction. I think that might even be an outdated number, because that was before some more sanctions were added. So I want to, kind of put this in the context of not just the Middle East, but other parts of the world too. I mean, when you kind of like pivot over to Latin America and you see the damage that's being done there, I mean, yes, you have this US empire in a sort of kind of decline, while at the same time inflicting so much misery on places that we've been to, like Cuba. I mean, Cuba right now is in a really dire situation. It stands to be seen what will be done in Venezuela, especially with the Secretary of State like Marco Rubio. I mean, I don't know, who knows how long he'll last. But I mean, in terms of, what we're seeing in Latin America, it's scary. I'm just curious your thoughts. Just kind of shifting away from the Middle East and looking towards Latin America, also a very important region of the world where, so many countries face the ire of US imperialism, including at this point, even a country like Panama, which has a fairly pro US government in place, and still, Trump is threatening them.
Well, in a way, we've gone through three important slogans already. Immediate ceasefire in Palestine, immediate end to the occupation of the Palestinians, number one. No war on the Iranians. I think that's a very credible threat that's there on the table. And it would be catastrophic because, as we've said, Rania, Iran is not just a country with a government. It's a very old and integrated civilization, and a full-scale war to destroy Iran would have an enormous catastrophic impact on the region, stretching right out, into the heart of India. It would be catastrophic. And the third was that, one hopes that they don't decide to go to war against China merely because they can't produce high-speed rail. Instead of going to war, yeah, it's like a
Sounds so
playground
crazy.
thing. Yeah, if you have the best toys, I'm going to smack you and steal them, rather than try to get your own things. Build your own in manufacturing and so on. But the fourth is important, and it has to do, you're quite right, with the Caribbean basin.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.